Okay, I'm sitting outside creating this because I'm in between parts of my day, so you might hear some noises of people walking by or birds chirping. But what I'm going to do is give you a little bit more in-depth overview of what you're looking at in the PowerPoint slides that I posted earlier today. There's a slide that you're seeing now on publishing and intentionality. And when I'm talking about intentionality, I'm talking about what's the intention of the author. Did the author mean for this item to be published? We've already talked about this a little bit so far this semester, and we're living in a time right now when publishing can happen in this classroom. So, you can sit here right now, publish something, and it'll go around the world because of the internet. You could publish in the hallway outside the door, you could be in your bedroom, you could be at a Starbucks or wherever, and with one click you've published or been published, because sometimes it's not intentional, and some of you might be familiar with how that can go down. That's not always particularly pleasant, but when we publish, even if it doesn't start as digital media, and I'm using publish very loosely here, it could be you've written something down on a piece of paper. We can't know where the documents are going to end up, so you don't know the reach of what it is that you're doing. When you're considering authorship and publication, I want you always to consider context, place, and audience, which leads me to the rhetorical triangle. You can see that displayed here on the screen. Your rhetorical triangle involves the speaker and writer. I'd also add text there, the subject, and the audience. Or you could take the same triangle and you could put audience, purpose, and text on it. So you might even want to pause and draw a triangle with audience, purpose, and context as the points in the triangle. In this next slide, you see I've titled it Audience and Purpose. I want you to consider how the women poets that you read wrote for their families, they wrote for circles of friends, and if they published in their lifetime, they wrote in small, hand-printed chapbooks, which were often paid for by friends. So the circulation of the poetry that is represented in your anthology was very small to begin with. It often involved only circles of friends. These were usually hand-printed materials, often meant to be keepsakes, so not the way at all that we think of books or editions. And what you see on the left is an actual 18th century chapbook. You see how small it is. That would have been only in small circulation. On the right, the image is of a contemporary chapbook, because people are still making these today. And if you see that there's a link click here, it's not going to work in the screencast. You have to actually load up the PowerPoint. But I was Googling for images for this, and I found out that you can actually get an 18th century chapbook made now. Well, it's not 18th century, but you get the idea. They're modeling it after the 18th century chapbooks. So there's a whole industry right now where you can get these types of materials made based on the past. In the materials that you read, there are many poems and essays that first appeared in the 1790s in magazines, and the women would write with pen names. So they weren't writing with their real name, but they would take on feminine pen names, and these were names like Eudora, Flora, Phyllis, Seraphina. So these types of names that were not necessarily the names somebody would have in their life, but a more romantic or mythical type of name. And women, they were disclosing their gender by choosing these names, but they were concealing their identity, so they didn't have their real name associated with these materials. And men actually did the same. So the literary scene emphasized gender bifurcation. If you're not familiar with that word, it's bifurcation, B-I-F-U-R-C-A-T-I-O-N. B-I-F-U-R-C-A-T-I-O-N, bifurcation. Gender bifurcation is like gender splitting it into two, in other words, men versus women. But Judith Sargent Murray challenged this. She subverted this demarcation. She often wrote under the name Constantia, but her essays addressed the public in a voice of a man. So there's actually a split going already with the name she published under and then the voice that she used. So she used a voice of a man even though she published under a pen name of a woman. And people knew who she was. That's another thing. Like, she has the pen name, but people knew who she was. And when I was looking for images for this slide, one of the things that came up, I typed in gender personae, and I ended up with all these anime links. So there might be a couple of you in the class who would know why, because I found out there's an anime, I guess it's a game or a cartoon on gender personae. With the idea of gender personae, we have, and I'm looking at the words on this slide right now, issues of gender identity, what people choose to conceal, what they choose to reveal, so you can get into queer aspects with this as well. Subversion, hiding, making things secret, and also the idea that print is disembodied. In other words, it's separate from the actual body. I want you to also think about poems as performance. That's why I chose this image of a spoken word performer. So that's something from today, and I always love this blend of past and present, but I want you to think about the types of poems that you read. They can be performances. You might hear an engine in the background. I'm sorry about that. The poems might have been obligatory, like they were written on command. They were obligated, in other words, to write them. You might see ceremonial poems, that they fall into a category of praising somebody in a ceremonial manner. There's some that are much more personal in their scope. So we have these three kinds of poems that I've identified: obligatory, ceremonial, such as, writing for George Washington or something, and personal. And I'm curious how you'd sort the poems. Which would go into what stack? Or if you want to just split it into two stacks, because you could put obligatory with ceremonial. Which ones go in which stack? What differences in voice or sound do you see between public and private poems? And how would you describe the differences between public and private poems? The idea of public and private poems dovetails nicely with the public and private virtue conversation that we had in yesterday's class as part of your lecture. So you can think about comparing these concepts of public and private to the Adams letters. You could think in terms of public and private virtue with masculine public virtue, which emphasized reason, and feminine private virtue, which was usually displayed as moral and apolitical. Of course, we know that these are constructs, so masculine public virtue is constructed. The idea is that only men would have reason displayed. No, of course that's not true. No more than it is that only the women's documents would be moral and apolitical. That's not true anyway. So there's an overlap with the concept of public and private virtue from yesterday's class. I have a few questions here. You could pause this and take a look at them, maybe incorporate answers in the blog. MOW is just initials of Mercy Otis Warren, who wrote to a patriotic gentleman. I was thinking that one's a tweener, like it's in between the public and private, that you might see something ceremonial and personal in it. You've got the poem by Anna Bleecker addressed to George Washington, but then addressed to Peggy. Anna Bleecker poem addressed to Peggy that turns to George Washington about 12 lines from the end. So there's hybridity in the poems that you're looking at. Mercy Otis Warren's To a Public Gentleman is written for a friend who's asked for a show of poetic skill, and it's written for commentary on the topics of poetry and friendship. So Mercy Otis Warren writes it for a friend, but it's also about poetry itself, poetry and friendship. The Bleecker poem, Peggy, like I have mentioned here, there's George Washington in it, GW. And you see then, I guess there's hybridity. So I guess I set you up in a way. I said, okay, is it this or is it that? And then, well, where do we see both? I have a few questions here. This is a place you could pause. You could think about the questions. You could jot things down and use it in your own blogs if you wish. So I'm not going to stop and read these because you can stop and read them. I'm going to move on to the next slide. I want to talk now about Judith Sargent Murray. She was the most outspoken woman and feminist voice of the 1790s. It was not very long after the American Revolution, and what you see in her work is the language of the Revolution adapted to other causes. For Murray, that is, of course, for women's causes. And what I want you to consider is, how does liberty affect women in a new republic? So that relationship between women and the concept of liberty in the new republic. Her work came out in Massachusetts Magazine. you can find this biographical information in your anthology and also online, but it's interesting to note that her first husband died, and her second marriage she married a Universalist minister, which was a new denomination. The Universalists believed that everyone could be saved, so just compare that to the Puritans. The idea everyone could be saved really affected her views on equality, and she noticed that young men, women, and children were offered a much better education than women, and that disturbed her. She had a self-made education, and you'll note that Murray writes in an intellectual style that's often more difficult even than Thomas Paine. Her most famous piece is on the equality of the sexes. It's very daring for her to pull this into a book. She took from the magazine publication she had, published them in a book, called it The Gleaner, and she was able to finance that through subscriptions. So people would pay to get The Gleaner. They'd pay in installments to get the book. So the question for this is, how is part 1 different from part 2? In 1790, there were very few original American books. So for Murray, putting this together, putting her work together from the magazine publications into a book was daring. And she was able to get prominent people like George and Martha Washington, and even John Adams, who was the president, and his wife Abigail Adams, to buy subscriptions to her book. And her names, having them as supporters, testified to her reputation. And so when The Gleaner came out, it wasn't just an ordinary event in American literature and historical events in American literature and culture. It's more than that, because she was very famous in her time because of her supporters and what she had to say, but by the middle of the 19th century, she was relatively unknown. So she had written on the equality of the sexes in 1779, but didn't publish it until later on. With On the Equality of the Sexes, you have a polemic. A polemic is an argument separated into two extremes, like poles, like North and South Pole. A polemic about gender inequality. It's didactic fiction. Didactic fiction is meant to teach and instruct. And she's asking a question about, well, what happens to a woman who pursues knowledge? In it, Murray looks at categories of intellect. And here's the categories represented here on the screen. It's something that I'm sure that you picked up on in your reading. There's all sorts of related arguments like nature versus nurture. What is the status of these different categories of intellect? Do men have more than women of certain things, and vice versa? I think today we'd say, well, no, but there's also a lot of linguistic theory that supports the way men and women speak differently that you might be able to tie to this, depending on what you've had in other classes and so forth. So there's an interesting kind of sideways way of looking at it. You can pause on these questions that I have. Again, I don't want to stop and read them and take up time during this lecture, because you can stop it and read. You can also download this PowerPoint if you haven't already to take notes. In The Gleaner, the last thing I want to touch on is how Murray tells a story of Miss Wellwood who'd been seduced. And there's a vital importance to other things we're going to read with seduction tales in the 18th century. We're going to be reading The Coquette and The Contrast. And in The Gleaner, she wrote it along the same lines as Susanna Rowson's book called Charlotte, A Tale of Truth. You might be familiar with that. It had sold nearly 200 editions, not the Murray book, but the Rowson book. But Murray picked up on it and told what was considered a real tale of seduction, and we're going to see how that gets picked up in this class by other writers. So that was meant to be a teaser for what you see coming later on, and get this related to what we're seeing for some work you're going to do next week. For tomorrow, you're going to be looking at Equiano's slave narrative, and we're going to see how we can get from here to there when we consider how we can relate this to overarching ideals of the Enlightenment in this period in American literature.